folks. Welcome back to the Podcast Digest. This is episode 60. 60. I cannot believe this has been 60 episodes so far, but I'm happy you guys have come along for the ride, and I really hope that you're enjoying what you've been hearing, as I like to say, filling up your subscription list with great shows, and that is what we're definitely going to be doing for you today. This is a recommendation episode. We haven't done this since episode 52, so a couple of months, but time to blast out 4 great shows for you as well. And I've had a lot of variety of guests, co-hosts, if you will, for these type of episodes. And I'm really happy to be joined by a previous guest on the show who actually said, hey, if you ever want to do that recommendation thing again, I'd love to join you. And so I'm very happy to welcome back to the Podcast Digest from Anxious Machine and The Herd, Rob McGinley Myers. Welcome back to the Podcast Digest.
Thank you so much for having me. You know, it's funny. I actually have considered starting a podcast club, in lieu of a book club with friends of mine, because I want to talk about podcasts more, but I've never gotten around to it. So this is my chance.
Well, here you go. It'll be your cold run, your audition for your future podcast club. I'm happy to be your audition space, Rob. That's for sure. Well, we've got a great docket of shows to talk about. We've got a discussion topic for you podcast aficionados as well. But before we get into any of that, for folks who, for some reason, are not familiar with you or The Herd at this point, The Herd, as most people know, has been one of my favorite podcast collectives, and I've featured many, many interviews, including last week with Tally Abacassis from First Day Back. If you missed that, go back and listen to that conversation with Tally. That was awesome. But Rob, tell folks a little bit about yourself, your show, and The Herd.
So my show is, it's a show, it's evolved over time. My most recent iteration is, I'm saying that it's a show about how humans are affected by the things that we've invented. It started out as a show where I was kind of trying to explore the human side of technology, how people are affected by technology. So not so much focus on technology itself, but the people. But I've just sort of kept expanding that definition of technology to the point now where I'm not even really talking about technology necessarily. I mean, I just launched season 3, and the first episode is about the history of why humans, or why Americans in particular, like to go on vacation in the wilderness, and when that started. You know, when did we stop seeing the wilderness as sort of a dangerous place or a place to be conquered, and when did we start seeing it as a place to kind of retreat to? And and then my latest episode is more traditional in a technology topic, which is mothers and smartphones. But one of the things that I keep trying to do is kind of look at the macro view of these things. And so I looked into the history of technology and mothers over the course of the 20th century. So that's what I've been up to. And then The Herd in general, we're just chugging along. I mean, one of our shows that you've had many of us on, but one of the shows that I think is the most interesting is How to Be a Girl, and that show's just taken off and gotten tons of exposure. Arrivals keeps putting out episodes every 2 weeks. Tally, I'm not supposed to say anything about it, but she may have found the subject for her second season. So yeah, it's very exciting times.
Yeah, and Tally talked a little bit about that last week as well. So many good things, folks, coming out of The Herd. All of them are great shows. And yes, I haven't gotten to Marlo. I haven't gotten to all of them yet, but, you know, it's still early days for the Podcast Digest, you know. Yeah. And folks, if you want to hear more from Rob and Anxious Machine in his show, we did have an in-depth interview released back on July 19th, episode 49. Go back and check that out for much, much more talk with Rob and his great show. But folks, what we're here to do today is to talk about some great podcasts and to let you know what we think you should be filling your subscription list with. But before we do that, listeners, longtime listeners of the Podcast Digest will know that I'd like to open these up with what I call a discussion section. It used to be called Listener Pro Tip, but it's sort of evolved into a more conversational nature. And as I've done with these previous shows, I've always asked my co-host, I call them co-hosts on these episodes, what we'd like to talk about. And Rob brought a really interesting topic to the table. And because of that, Rob, if you don't mind, I'll ask you to introduce our discussion topic.
Well, so this was interesting. I saw it linked to, and it seemed like it was an article or sort of a discussion between the host of Planet Money, or one of the hosts of Planet Money, Adam Davidson, and a consultant who I guess does sort of audience research for National Public Radio. And it was the two of these guys going back and forth about what podcasting means for the future of public radio. And what it turned out, it actually started as a comment thread. Adam Davidson had been on a podcast called The Pub, which is about public radio. And this guy, John Sutton, had responded to that episode in the comments saying that he thought that it was not very well informed about the way that public radio works and the audience for public radio. And essentially what the debate boiled down to was that Adam Davidson sees the fact that as soon as people discover podcasts and discover especially these kind of longer form narrative, in-depth reporting style podcasts, along the lines of the Radiotopia shows and the Gimlet shows and shows like those in the Herd, that they just crave more and more of that. And that given the choice between that and what's typically on shows like All Things Considered and Morning Edition, they tend to choose those shows because they're just much more kind of dramatic and riveting, and that the audience is incredibly engaged, and that he really thinks that unless National Public Radio can figure out how to make those kinds of shows and get in on that business, that the two big mainstays of National Public Radio, Morning Edition and All Things Considered, might just kind of wither on the vine.
Yeah, and I read this article that you'd sent over, and you're right, it's not a traditional article. It does kind of play as a conversation back and forth, maybe lifted from the comment threads, and I know John Sutton references a lot of Adam Davidson's quotes from his podcast appearance on The Pub, but a lot of really interesting debate topics, if you will, and positions are taken on a lot of things that have to do with story-driven podcasts, long form versus short form. Some really interesting conversation regarding CPM rates and advertising, and some large blanket general statements about NPR today being a little more bland and risk averse. Some really interesting topics kind of came out of this discussion. You mentioned the one that sort of stood out for you was the necessary evolution of NPR towards a more longer form, story-driven, good, high-quality audio to be able to survive. Is this something you feel as well, Rob?
Well, what's interesting about it for me is because I worked in public radio for about 6 years. I worked as a producer for Garrison Keillor's show, The Writer's Almanac, and then I worked for Krista Tippett's show On Being. And I was there at a time when, there were shows that you could do freelance stories for, and that's where I started kind of cutting my teeth on making radio. But the only kinds of stories that young producers could make were these 4 and 5 minute, and if you were really luxurious, you could maybe do like a 7-minute story. And it was just very hard to, tell the kinds of stories that you might hear on a show like This American Life. And that was really the only show at the time that was doing those kinds of stories. And that's part of the reason why so many podcasters today cite This American Life as their inspiration, is they heard those stories and they thought, oh my God, like that's a real, that's a story you can really kind of sink your teeth into. And I would love to make those kinds of stories, but This American Life was sort of like the New Yorker, it's not easy to sell them a story, and there was nowhere else that was going to buy a story like that. And so there were all of these incredibly talented, ambitious radio producers in the system working for these shows as producers and maybe doing the occasional 5-minute story for one of these shows that takes freelancing, but none of them were getting to stretch their wings, or very few of them were getting to stretch their wings. And now with podcasting, suddenly there's this opportunity for all these people to try making those kinds of stories. And what is happening is that people are just gobbling it up. I mean, the more that people discover podcasting and get into podcasting, they just love it. And most of the people that I know who have gotten into podcasting in the last couple of years, in terms of listening to it, don't even listen to the radio anymore because it doesn't have the same appeal. These 4 and 5 minute stories, they feel like, eating something with no flesh on the bones, and so I feel like there's going to come a point at which all of the people who have smartphones stop listening to the radio. And then where does that leave NPR if they're still making the same kinds of stories? I don't know.
But what do you think in terms of a broader audience? I agree with you, for the record. I, too, find much more satisfaction out of a longer form story, that 15, 20, 30 minutes. And I've been on the record in previous episodes saying that I don't consider episode length a real particular issue in podcasting, because I've always believed that if the content's good, I'll listen as long as the content continues to be, engaging and entertaining. But I think one of the things that came out in this conversation between Sutton and Davidson was this concept that the short form for radio tends to work because people are in their drive time, or people are, have shorter bursts of attention, or could be doing other things. So this shorter form may continue to have a life in radio, and potentially even in podcasting if people were to string those shorter stories together. Is that from a broader audience appeal? What about that argument?
Well, I should specify that when I say longer form, I mean like longer than 5 minutes. Most of the longer form stories that I'm talking about are stories that are like 20 minutes long, which in the podcasting world is actually pretty short, right? But I'm sorry, something you said there sparked an idea, and now let me think for a minute about what that was, because darn it.
I think the context for me was, is that smaller bite size
yes.
episode an attractive thing for, say, somebody super on the go or something of that nature?
Yeah. No, so one of the points that they made in that discussion that I thought was really interesting was, and I think Adam Davidson made this point, that format of these short stories is designed for people getting in and out of their cars. Because if you get in your car and the story, and you're in the middle of one of those stories, it doesn't matter that you don't understand exactly what they're talking about, because it can be over in 2 minutes anyway. And then you'll hear the next story, and then you'll hear the next story. And then when you get wherever you're going, you don't feel too invested in whatever it was you were listening to that you have to sit in your car for another 20 minutes to finish it, right?
Right.
Of course, they talk about those driveway moments, which are the moments where you are forced to sit in your car and finish it. And that's typically one of those more in-depth stories. But what podcasting does, because podcasting is on-demand listening, suddenly you get to decide when the story starts and when the story ends. And so there's no longer a necessity for worrying about, your ability to follow a longer story, because you get to decide when it starts. And I think what's happening in the audio world is that on-demand listening it's having a similar effect to what's happening in the television world, where lots of people are starting to watch things streaming on Netflix or on Amazon instead of, kind of appointment viewing. Right. And it's changing what people want to watch. People want to watch TV shows now that have much more in-depth storylines where it continues week to week, because they can follow it better. Whereas it used to be that they would have, these very episodic structures for TV shows, so that if you missed an episode, it wouldn't matter. Each episode had its own ending. But now that people can control when they watch, they can see much more in-depth storylines. And that's happening in audio. And I just don't think NPR has quite caught up to that. At least I think, I don't know. And the other thing that I think is really interesting about all of this is that what I've discovered in the last few years of listening to podcasts is that it's a medium that weirdly fits into your life better than almost anything else.
Right.
Because once you realize that you can put in like one earphone and listen to podcasts while you're mowing the lawn or doing the dishes or commuting to work, or, all the sort of in-between times of your day where you used to, have to deal with the boredom of your housework or whatever, you suddenly can have all of this amazing stories going on in your head. And I feel like the market for that is just vast, and people haven't even realized how big that is.
Oh, boy, do I ever agree with that. I mean, that was the whole gestation of the idea of me even starting this show, and I am one of those single earbud people all the time. So I completely agree with that, and I completely agree that I think as more people figure it out, realize it, recognize it, that podcasting is in for a huge continued growth spurt, as it has been for much of the last 10 years, this slow, continual, gradual growth. Let me ask you about this, Rob, because I found this pretty interesting. And with your background, with your work in public radio, as well as obviously now some significant time as a podcaster, there's a lot of conversation in this back and forth between Sutton and Davidson about the metrics and CPM rates. And I find it really interesting in the sense that, as you know, and I'm sure you would agree with this, podcasting doesn't have a lot of great metrics, right? We get download numbers. We can sometimes pull some regional things out of that. We could maybe pull out sources, whether it came from a web browser or a particular application. But that's it. We can't tell if they actually played the episode, how long they played it, where they fast forwarded, why did they finish it. So many unanswered questions in the podcast data, and I think that was a lot of John Sutton's arguments in many places. What is your feeling, given your background, regarding sort of where podcasting is and its ability to evaluate or lack thereof of sort of what our audiences are?
Yeah, well, I mean, I thought that was interesting. And Adam Davidson conceded the point that there aren't great metrics for podcasting. But the one thing that he did bring up, and I think he admitted that this was anecdotal, but it still was really meaningful to him, is the level of engagement of the audience with the podcast compared to the radio audience. And the example, he gave a couple of examples, one of which was that when a podcast gets rebroadcast on This American Life, like This American Life will occasionally pick up an episode of a podcast as one of their segments. And what the podcasters have said is that they don't get a big bump in their numbers the weekend that episode of This American Life is airing on the radio, that the bump in their numbers don't occur until the Monday morning that This American Life releases their podcast. And so it's all these people listening to the podcast of This American Life who suddenly then turn and listen to this, this other podcast that they just heard on This American Life. And so they see the value of, that the engagement of that audience, that they are looking for more content like that. And then the other example that he gave was that he said in his years, he's worked in public radio for something like 15 years, and he said that he'd been contacted by listeners about a story that he'd done like maybe 5 times, and that now when he appears on a podcast, he gets contacted by listeners, more than that every single episode that he's on. Right. And I would definitely say I feel that. I mean, people tweet at me, they write me emails, I've asked for people to submit stories to my show, and I've gotten those. And when I was, on public radio, I did a bunch of freelance stories, and they had like a comment thing on their website where you could comment on the story, and nobody ever commented on it. So I don't know if that's a great metric, but it's definitely something I feel that people feel closer to the hosts of podcasts than they do to the hosts on the radio, because it's just a more intimate medium.
Yep, I completely agree. And I think it's a redefining of the term active versus passive listening. Most of us turn on the radio as background more often than not, right? The radio's on while we're driving, the radio's on while we're hosting friends over, or the radio's on while we're doing laundry, or whatever the case may be. Whereas podcasts, to kind of build off a point you made earlier, we are intentionally placing that earbud in our ear, opening our podcast player of choice, selecting the show that we would like to hear, and hitting play. Now, we could be doing other things at the same time, but we have actively gone through a process to put this audio so often through an earbud or headphones and tend to be much more engaged. Even the act of finding that show took that listener something. They had to open that purple icon on their iPhone. They had to click that link in their Facebook feed or Twitter and then ultimately hit subscribe or download. There is a built-in inherent engagement that doesn't exist by hitting the power on in your car. And I think that's what we're seeing. And what's interesting, or more interesting, is they talked a lot about the advertising rates. At this point, advertisers are still seeing the effect of this much more engaged, enthusiastic, focused audience, especially if it's a well-advertised product placed in the right show. And the ROI for the advertisers is there. And so the rates are still higher today in the digital version of or podcast version of a lot of audio content than it is in the radio. Now, they do mention that it's probably going to come down in time, and certain campaigns have been running for a very long time. If you're a podcast listener, Squarespace, Linda, all of these folks. And those folks are really podcasters' best friends because they have helped prop up this medium during its first 10 years. But, part of the thing is that a lot of folks have already heard those spots. But it's interesting to me that there is a distinction in the advertiser's mind between a public radio audience in terms of the rates they're willing to pay versus a podcast audience. And even though the audience is truly smaller in terms of listenership at this point, but they're willing to pay more for that smaller audience.
Yeah. I mean, I don't have that much experience working with advertisers, so I don't know that much about that. But I would definitely say that, when you hear, I feel like this could go in a completely different direction, so maybe we shouldn't go down that road. I mean, okay. There's been a lot of debate about should podcasters be endorsing the things that they advertise, right, or should they just be reading the copy? Yeah. And that's become something that, there's been a lot of discussion about. And I don't really know where I come down on that. But I definitely think I'm more willing to listen to a podcast advertisement by the host than I would be by some sort of inserted. I mean, even on public radio, most of the copywriting is inserted by like a different reader, yep, and it sounds sort of robotic. It doesn't feel like a part of the conversation, whereas on podcasts, it usually does. And
absolutely.
I think that's definitely valuable.
Yeah, I think what you're alluding to, I'm going to predict that what you were talking about was especially the guys from Reply All that came up big time. And what's funny is, it makes sense to me that it came up. Alex Goldman is a previous guest here on the Podcast Digest, and I told this to him when I had a chance to talk to him, is that Reply All, as far as I'm concerned, might have, this is a strong statement, but might have the best advertising reads of any podcast I've heard. Because I actually don't skip any ads in Reply All. And I, like many people listening right now, do a lot of ad skipping. That, that plus 30 is a valuable button in many, many shows that a lot of us listen to regularly. However, Reply All, I never skip the ads. Why? Because they make them interesting. They make them engaging. It is not that straight copy read, and it is for that reason that I end up, the advertising that ends up going on Reply All gets to my ears much more frequently than many other shows do. And while they obviously have to walk a line, and that is what you're alluding to with some of the conflict that the Alex and PJ have felt over some of their episodes, it is a risk that does have tangible results, I think, in terms of effectiveness.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of different topics, as I mentioned, a lot of different things, and really there's so much more that we could get into in terms of that article. There is a link in the show notes, folks, to the articleized version of the back and forth that John Sutton and Adam Davidson had. And if you are a podcast fan, a podcast aficionado, or just find this conversation interesting, it's a really good read. And go to the comments as well. I was mentioning before we hit record to Rob that Adam refers to one of the heads of NPR, and then he came in the comments as well, and they had an additional back and forth, and just sort of fleshes out the story and the tale even that much more. So an excellent read and an excellent discussion. Thanks for bringing that one to the table, Rob. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem.
So let's get into some show recommendations. Howie, speaking of listening to great podcasts, that is something Rob and I both do, and we've got some to tell you about this episode. So, Rob, would you prefer to go first, or would you like me to set the template for you?
Why don't you go first?
All right, this I can do. 2 shows each, folks, and this is not formal for me, but Rob and I talked about it beforehand, that I've sort of naturally evolved into this, but one of the things I like to do is kind of maybe highlight one of the bigger names that you've probably heard of, but maybe haven't subscribed to, and then one smaller show that maybe you haven't heard of. I mean, that is sort of what I've tried to do here on the Podcast Digest, big or small, high listenership or not. If I think it's great, I want you to know about it. So that's sort of what I think we've both done with our show selections tonight. So let's start with my first one, which, if you would be the big one. Something that some of you may have heard about, but maybe have not downloaded or tried. I did several months ago, and it has been a staple of my podcast listening. It is something completely different. It's called Dinner Party Download. I'm sorry. From Infinite Guest and American Public Media. They call themselves the Culture and Leisure section of public radio, speaking as a segue from the public radio conversation we've just had. Dinner Party Download is an extraordinary show. It airs in something like 125 markets on public radio all across the country, but it also has a companion podcast list, companion podcast that comes out along with the regular radio broadcast. And wow, I can't even imagine producing this show, because what you hear in each episode is extraordinarily highly produced segments that open with an icebreaker. It's sort of framed all around the concept of attending a dinner party. So there is an icebreaker opening, which is usually some stupid pun-like joke, but I probably laugh just about every time I hear it. Then it goes into sections where there's music that you would play at a dinner party, and oftentimes they have a musician who is talking about music that they like, that they would potentially play at a dinner party. So they give you 3 or 4 songs that sort of end up being like a playlist, and they usually recommend one of their own as well. Then they move into sort of an etiquette session, and they talk about drinks, a cocktail hour for the dinner party, and they usually are reaching out to a bartender in some part of the country who has some special drink recipe. And then they go on to different segments, and they ultimately feature anywhere from 2 to 3 interviews, anywhere from 5 to 7 minutes each, with some huge names, guys. I cannot believe some of the guests that they have had participate in Dinner Party Download. Pretty much everyone has been on the show in one way or another, from musicians to actors to writers to artists, and on and on and on and on. And it's really entertaining, and it is super highly edited and super well produced. One of the recent episodes was a little bit less so, as they were at the LA Pod Festival with they had Aisha Tyler on there, but they've had Mel Brooks on there. They've had Patrick Stewart. They've had I believe I even read at one point that I think Tom Hanks has done this show.
Wow.
I mean, it is just about everyone, and I mean that. Actually, Peter Capaldi is actually the current episode. He's the current Doctor Who. He's appeared on there. There are 320 episodes in. I'm scrolling through their list right now. Eddie Redmayne was a recent replay, but he was the guy who did what was the movie recently with Stephen Hawking. He won the Academy Award for playing Stephen Hawking, and they've just had so many great guests. It makes it wonderfully entertaining, and something that I think everyone should at least try, because there's so many different styles and things that are in this show, from comedy to music to interviews, and it's completely worth it. I don't know why it took me as long to discover it as I did. Like I said, it was only maybe 2 or 3 months ago that I hopped on this thing, but wow, it is one that has immediately jumped to my regular must play list. And
is it the same? Is it the same hosts every time?
Yes, they have 2 hosts that generally sort of run things that kind of take care of it. And let me get that up here. This is Rico Gagliano and Brendan Francis Noonan are the two regular hosts, and they've got a great back and forth as well. And they conduct the interviews, and they both have long backgrounds in public radio.
I remember Rico Gagliano he used to be a mainstay on Marketplace stuff, and he was always hilarious.
Been on Marketplace, and I'm looking at his bio here. He's been heard on All Things Considered, Weekend America, The Savvy Traveler. He's been all over the place. He's worked as a TV writer for shows on MTV, ABC, Fox Family, Cartoon Network. He's been a freelance print reporter for LA Weekly, The Village Voice. I mean, these are big hitters right here, and they work together and put together. And same thing with Brendan. He's also been on Marketplace Money, Fresh Air, Weekend America. It is coming from some very qualified professionals, and it is definitely worth your listen, folks. You will wildly enjoy Dinner Party Download. Have you heard this at all, Rob?
I haven't. In my mind, I pictured it as like another sort of sit around a table and talk about pop culture kind of a show. But it sounds like it's much more structured than that. And so
much more.
Definitely check that out.
Yeah, and now that I'm on this About page, previous guests have also included Pharrell Williams, Scarlett Johansson, Steve Martin, and on and on. I mean, the biggest names in entertainment have done this show.
Huh.
Yeah, as somebody who's regularly recruiting guests, I'm thinking to myself, wow, that would be nice.
Yeah.
No offense, Rob.
Although I recently heard an interview with Ira Glass, and he said that he hates interviewing famous people.
Oh, yeah?
Because they're so good at not answering your questions.
Right.
And he's like, when you just have an ordinary person and they have a story to tell, it's easy to get them to tell it. If it's a dramatic thing that happened to them, they want to tell that story.
I could definitely see that. Completely understandable. Well, these guys do make it good. They have some standard questions as well. One of the ones at the end of each one is, if we met you at a dinner party, what is a question we shouldn't ask you? That's one of their questions to these celebrities. So it always brings up some interesting conversation. But that's my first show recommendation, folks. Dinner Party Download. Link in the show notes as well. Give it a shot. I promise you will find something you like out of it. So, Rob, throwing it over to you. What is your first show recommendation?
Okay, so one of the things I'm glad about doing this is that it forced me to check out some new shows, because I didn't want to come and just recommend shows that everybody's heard of. But maybe people have already heard of this show, because it was recently, I think, #1 on the iTunes charts, which is Limetown. You've checked out this show, right?
Believe it or not, no. And which is why I've been meaning to, and I know they're not very far into it, which I'm sure you're about to talk to. So I was thinking, I could catch up real quick. I just haven't gotten there yet. Tell me all about it.
Well, so I had heard the name. I think I saw it recommended by The Timber. And then when I saw that it was a fiction show, I was a little reluctant to try it, because as much as I think it's cool that people are experimenting with fiction in podcasting, none of the fiction shows have ever really taken with me. And I think it's because they often come across to me as just a little too staged. And so it just documentary just makes more sense to me on the radio. But then I found out that the way the show is constructed is that it's actually constructed like a documentary. It's basically a fake documentary. Right. And so if you think about, movies like paranormal, what's the paranormal
Activity?
Paranormal Activity, yeah.
Right.
So there's movies like that, or the Blair Witch Project.
Right.
This radio show is sort of like that, in that it's constructed as like a public radio documentary investigating the disappearance of 300-some people from a town. I can't remember exactly where it is. Somewhere in the South, like South Carolina.
Tennessee, I believe.
Tennessee, okay. Yeah. And that these people were part of some sort of neurological experiment, that they were living in this town and conducting experiments, and then suddenly they all disappeared. And so this woman, who has sort of a relation to the case because her uncle was one of the people who disappeared, is investigating it. And so it plays out as if you're listening to, like Serial or This American Life, doing this story. And what I love about that premise is that it allows them to not try, it doesn't sound like a radio drama. It sounds like, it's bits and pieces of interview tape going back and forth. And there's, musical scoring, just like in, the best of the narrative podcasts. And, but then it turns into this very creepy sort of X-Files-y story that each, there have been 2 main episodes so far and then 1 very mini short episode. But each of the 2 main episodes ends, of course, with a cliffhanger. And I mean, I wouldn't say it's perfect. There's definitely parts of it. I mean, I used to write fiction, and so I'm always thinking, as like a workshopper, like what would I tell this person if I was, giving them feedback in a workshop. But and there's parts where the dialogue feels like a little too written. Like I sort of wish they had their actors improvising more instead of maybe reading script. But it doesn't stop me from wanting to hear the next episode as soon as possible. So I definitely recommend checking it out if you like sort of creepy stories and this interesting use of, podcasting to make what sounds like a nonfiction podcast that's actually a fiction podcast.
How do you think a show like this, that, as we mentioned, is only 2 episodes in, basically, as we record here, how do you think a show like this jumps to the top of the charts? What do you think is involved with this? Do you think this is just a hunger on the listeners' part for something like this?
Well, I have no information to back this up, so this is completely made up theory of my own. But people were shocked a couple of years ago when Welcome to Night Vale jumped to the top of the iTunes podcasting charts, right?
Right.
And I think the reason they were shocked was that typically people have seen podcasts as being the domain either of comedians or of public radio. And I think that what they're finding is that the same people who obsess about Buffy the Vampire Slayer or, Star Trek or, horror movies, that those people are getting into podcasting and have been getting into podcasting. And that every time a show comes out that appeals to that, kind of subsection of the podcasting world, they just go crazy for it. And they all talk about it on, Reddit or whatever. And they are not the target audience for, National Public Radio necessarily, but they're a huge audience. I mean, and probably, the same people who play lots of video games. And I mean, it's that group of people who they're large enough to launch a show like this to the top of the charts. And I think that more shows that appeal to that audience are going to continue to do well.
It sounds completely reasonable to me. I mean, I think you're probably well close to the target there in terms of how something like this can happen as well. I'll add just one little piece onto it, as I haven't heard it yet, but now after hearing your description, I definitely now want to go. And like I said, it's been on my to-do list. Go ahead.
And can I just make one mini side recommendation? Because this the show reminded me of one of my very favorite scary movies. I really like scary movies. And there's a lot of these sort of fake documentary scary movies. But the very best one that I've ever seen is a movie called Lake Mungo. It's from Australia. And it plays out, just like this podcast, it plays out like a real documentary, like a documentary done by a real film crew. It's not sort of an amateur documentary. And but it's investigating this girl who drowned and whether or not her ghost has come back. And it's just an incredible movie. So I highly recommend Lake Mungo. That's just a bonus recommendation there.
Was that post Blair Witch?
I don't know. I discovered it on Netflix several years ago. I don't actually know when it came out. It came out maybe sometime in the last 10 years.
Part of me thinks Blair Witch started all of this, but I don't know if that's true, and I don't want to misrepresent, people following that actually led this concept of the idea of something that is actually fictional but portrayed as real. Because I saw Blair Witch Project in the theaters.
Yeah,
it scared the crap out of me, and it was... And I was young at that time. I'm 36 today, so I don't know how old it was. 16, 17, 18, somewhere in there when it came out. And I went and, back then, and this was, mid-90s, the internet didn't give things away all the time, and I went into that movie having no idea that this was not what it appeared to be, and it was amazing. It was only after I came back home and started reading things, I think I was a subscriber to Entertainment Weekly at the time, and then I realized, oh, that was actually fake, and kind of, peeled away the impression. But that seemed to start something, and I could be wrong about it starting, but this podcast and so many others, as we've talked about before, and folks probably know of others that are doing something similar with the concept of a fictionalized, represented as reality podcast. But it is definitely something that is built on the shoulders of movies like that. And I think it is wildly entertaining.
Yeah.
For sure. Oh, the point I was going to add on earlier was the one little bit I would say about this is that I would throw this in with one of my theories, which is I think any show with absolutely excellent album art will get attention, and Limetown has that. They've got a great font that sort of has it crossed out, and then they've got their picture is just this old, weathered, boarded up window of what is apparently supposed to be of the mental hospital. I believe is sort of the main location for a lot of this, and it's just to come up with album art that is so representative of what they're doing, I think is a great choice. I'm a big believer in album art.
Yeah.
Call me crazy. All right, our second show recommendation. So we've got Dinner Party Download and Limetown as what we're calling our big shows, right, Rob? That was your big, widely known show. So now we're going to get into our potentially lesser known shows, and not for obviously fans of these shows already. And there are many people, I believe, who would have heard of both of these. But I'm doing something completely different. One of the things I aimed to do with the Podcast Digest was hopefully to cover as many different genres as I possibly can. And longtime listeners of the show, or people who just scroll through my website, will realize I haven't done a great job at that, right? I've really hit a lot of my favorites. Anybody would know at this point the narrative storytelling podcast and the tech podcast are two of pretty much my favorite shows. I make no qualms about that, but I do have an eye to other genres and trying to make sure I get in some representation of some other niches as well. And I went through, folks may know, may not know, if you go to the website, thepodcastdigest.info, there is a tab along the right-hand column that allows you, the listener, or you, the podcast host or producer, to submit your show or a show that you love or you've heard about or you've been a long-time subscriber to and would like to see featured here on the Podcast Digest, to basically fill out a quick little form, tell me all about it, and I'll check it out. In that form, in that growing database I've got now, is pretty much my main source for finding new stuff when I want to check out something else and figure out what I may end up talking about next here on the show. And my second show recommendation of the evening came from that list as well. It was submitted to my form back on September 2nd. And just from the description as well, it was the host that submitted it from the description. It sounded interesting to me, so I went ahead and downloaded it and took a look. And over the last several days, actually, I have plowed through every episode of the show. This is called The Mo Show. The host and creator is Motion Melvin, is his name. Seriously, it's Motion, like ocean with an M before it. He's on Twitter at Motion Melvin, and the show website is themoshowpodcast.com. This is a comedy podcast, but a comedy podcast that I think is completely different than what you may have heard. This is sort of the comedy equivalent of Rob's show. I would consider this the comedy equivalent of Anxious Machine or of This American Life or any of these type of storytelling narrative podcasts that we've all enjoyed talking about so much. This is the comedy version of it. Let me just let you know what Motion sent to me in terms of his description because I think it fits. He says, the Mo Show podcast is a fully scripted, fully produced comedy podcast. The show is loosely based on the life of himself as a voice actor, and it parodies the crazy world of voiceovers along with almost everything else. And he says, we have the best voiceover talent and the best engineering talent that LA has to offer coming together each week to make the funny. We know we are producing top shelf audio, and we believe it's also top shelf comedy. But that is for you and the listeners to decide. So upon checking this show out, holy moly, do I ever agree with super highly produced. This takes the cake, maybe, of any editing performance I've ever heard. This is a cast of professional voiceover actors putting this together, so you can imagine what the full-on production is. They have everything from sound beds to sound effects to staging conversations to radio ads to commercials to TV to all kinds of different things. And it's something to behold. I do want to say, and they have an intro before every episode, and they make this clear, this is adult listening. If there is a kid listening to it, don't listen to this. If you are an adult who is, I don't want to say easily offended, but isn't a big fan of language, maybe skip it. But if, walking the line of controversial statements or language isn't too big a deal for you, check this thing out. The best way that I've been trying to sort of come up with what I would consider a parallel for this. This is sort of Kevin Smith meets Mel Brooks and Robert Zemeckis. This is kind of the comedy that you're looking at. You've got sort of the teenage-style crudeness of Kevin Smith, but you also have kind of the tongue-in-cheek stupidity style of a Mel Brooks or Robert Zemeckis. I love this show. This is, it's only about 10 to 15 minutes each. They've only done 13 episodes so far. It looks like they were at one time about at a weekly episode. Then it kind of fell to 2 weeks. I think they took August off. Hard to say, but they are 13 episodes in right now. And you will blast through these super quick if this is something that you really enjoy. It was that needle in a haystack for me, the diamond in the rough, if you will, and I am absolutely a committed subscriber of this show. If you like comedy, adult comedy, I literally laughed out loud on any number of occasions as I was working through these episodes, and the production values are through the roof. Rob, have you heard of The Mo Show at all?
I feel like I've heard that name, but as you're describing it, what I don't understand is, are they telling stories? Are they just riffing off of things? Like, what does an episode consist of?
It's fully scripted. Okay, so there is a story within each episode, right? Some of the episodes up to this point, one of them focused on sports, one of them focused on LA, one of them focused on sort of their pilot sort of interestingly tells a story to how the show started. They have, it's not improv at all, but they ultimately, it's sort of sketch comedy tied together in a loosely held story, if you will. But it's really, it's one of those ones you've got to check it out to really sort of understand what it is. I would say there is a story, but it's not necessarily serialized, and it's not kind of, there's no continuity. Each one of these sort of stands by itself. Sort of like a sitcom, if you will.
Okay. Interesting.
It is a definitely an interesting show. If you want something different, The Mo Show is something different. And I'm happy to recommend it only because it is so clear the work that they put into this and the quality that they produce, and the fact that they have jumped onto my submission list means that they want more people to come and check out the great work they're doing. And I know there are so many shows that are doing great work. The Mo Show won't be every single person's cup of tea that's listening to that, and that's perfectly okay. But some of you will absolutely love this, and I hope that you do. So that's my second show recommendation, the Mo Show podcast, and links in the show notes as well. So Rob, your second show recommendation.
Okay, so this is another show that I just checked out recently, and I believe I also discovered this from the Timber, who are the king and queen of all podcast recommendations I was going to say in print, but I guess in web print. I don't know. But so this show, it's called Home Stories from LA. And I have to say that at first that title kind of turned me off a little bit because I don't have any attachment to LA, and I sort of feel like people from I have sort of a negative association with LA. I don't really know why. But what this show demonstrates is that actually LA is a really interesting place, and I immediately figured out why the creator of the show, whose name I had his name in front of me a second ago. Do you have his name?
Bill Barrell.
Bill Barrell. Yeah. So the show is created by this guy Bill Barrell, who is a longtime print journalist. He's written for Newsweek and for The New Yorker and for various print publications. And I try to look up and see how he made the jump to podcasting, but I couldn't figure that out. But what he seems to be doing is looking at stories about people living in LA because he sees LA as this interesting place in America. He calls it it's where the road ends, because when Europeans came to the United States, they slowly pushed westward and eventually got to the West Coast, and that's where sort of the journey west ended. And so he's kind of looking at different characters who have wound up there at this place where the road ends. And the first episode focuses on a guy who composed music for horror movies in the 1950s and kind of tells his life story by way of all the people who sort of knew him in his neighborhood. And that it also focuses on his house, which was this house that he and his wife designed and built together. And the show interviews the couple who bought the house after he died, and what they found in the house. There was this closet that had been sealed off. And I'm not going to give away what was in the closet, but so the episode is constructed in this interesting way because you're getting to hear, the horror movie music that he composed and his life story, and also the story of, what it was like to be a composer in 1950s Hollywood, where, he had ambitions of being like a real classical composer and felt sort of like he'd wound up in Los Angeles making movie music was a big letdown for him. And so he's just this interesting character, and it's this interesting character study. And then the second episode does a very similar thing, except it's with the Beach Boys. And what the second episode is about is the effort to preserve the home, the childhood home of Brian Wilson and his brothers, where they first started singing together as kids before they became the Beach Boys. And again, it weaves the story of this, famous American band and their kind of troubled relationship with their father and their troubled relationship with each other, all focused around or kind of circling around the story of the house that they grew up in. And so both of these episodes they take an interesting sort of artistic character in Los Angeles and tell the story of their life by way of the home that they lived in for many years. And it's just, it's a really ambitious show. You can tell that he's a writer because the script that he writes is really it's really great. But he's also a great interviewer, and he weaves together a lot of different voices on each episode, and so the production value is super high. I'm really excited to see what he does next. I'm not really sure how he can produce episodes of this quality every 2 weeks, because I know that interviewing just two people and trying to weave those together for me is pretty tough. But I highly recommend checking out this show.
And Home Stories from LA, I wanted to mention as well, was also a part of Bill actually also reached out to me via the form submission as well back on September 15th. So I'm very happy to that, Rob, that you were able to tell everybody about this show. And darn it, there's another one for my subscription list.
Well, and these episodes are short. They're around 20-ish minutes, so they're not too bad.
And you know what? I have high hopes, not only because of your full-throated recommendation, Rob, but I don't know if you noticed this. There's something interesting about the website that Bill's put together as well. Back on the bottom left-hand corner, and I don't know how I caught this just scrolling through, he's got a little segment that's called Listen Here. On there are a ton of great shows, some of which have been featured here on the Podcast Digest, Criminal, and others. You must remember this, but some of my other favorites as well, Fugitive Waves, Love and Radio. But did you know Nocturne is also on this list?
Aha.
Another member of the herd.
Yeah, people love the Nocturne.
People love the Nocturne. Yes, Vanessa will be happy with the shout out. But yeah, I found that interesting. He's got 99% Invisible, Criminal, Fugitive Waves, Love and Radio, The Memory Palace, Mystery Show, Nocturne, Radio Diaries, Snap Judgment, and You Must Remember This. I mean, if these are the things that Bill Barrow's listening to, then it's definitely worth checking out his show because he's got great taste in that Listen Here list he constructed. So
yes, he does.
So that is 4 show recommendations, folks. I don't see any reason why you shouldn't be adding all 4 of these. We've got new shows, old shows, big shows, small shows. We've actually covered all those in our 4 show recommendations. So I think we did a pretty good job. Rob, what do you think?
I think so too.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank you again, Rob, for taking the time to join me, your second appearance on the Podcast Digest. And I think I'm just done counting how many times I've had members of the herd on the show for one reason or another. I think I'm just going to create a spin-off podcast called, The Herd Digest or something.
Sounds good to me.
It's definitely within good reason, folks. So, Rob, can you, one more time, tell folks where they can find you, your show, and the herd online?
Well, my website is anxiousmachine.com, and I'm on Twitter at Rob McMyers or Anxious Machine, both. And then the Herd's website is theherdradio.com, and that's HEARD. And then we're on Twitter at The Herd Radio.
Excellent. Follow all those folks, and there's so much great listening. If you're not familiar with Rob and his show Anxious Machine or The Herd or any of these ones that we've now recommended to you on this episode, I guarantee you will fill up your subscription list. You'll find so many great things to subscribe to, and you'll be thanking us later. And please let us know. Twitter, email, Facebook, let us know that you have enjoyed some of these recommendations. Rob, thanks again for taking the time. And folks, thanks again for tuning in to episode 60 of the Podcast Digest. Sincerely hope you enjoyed listening. If you have, rating, review, iTunes, Stitcher, wouldn't hurt at all, wouldn't mind it, would greatly appreciate it, as a matter of fact. Thanks for listening, folks. Until next week for the Podcast Digest, my name is Dan Lizette, and I'll talk to you then.
Thank you for listening to the Podcast Digest. You can follow the show on Twitter at PodDigest. Like the show on Facebook at facebook.com/The Podcast Digest. Email the show feedback at thepodcastdigest@gmail.com. And you can find all the previous episodes and exclusive blog entries at the show's website, thepodcastdigest.info.